It is an issue being a small country. Everybody does know everybody. I mean, in the end, you have to draw a line between your personal life and your opinions on deep seabed mining. It's just that they have a different value system, parts of the environment that we're more concerned about. I guess the question is what level of impact is going to be too great. Our opinion of what level of environmental damage or the Prime Minister would have, what's acceptable and the extent of damage.
When you talk about mining, you are like asking a blind person to describe a picture which they have never seen. They have no idea about colour, structure, anything. They just have no inkling of what it's about.
Welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining podcast. I'm Eric Young. Joining me today is Imogen Ingram. And I think I'll just let you introduce yourself and tell the audience who you are and where you come from.
Kia ora ana, Imogen Ingram. I have a traditional leader's title called Te Pāmataiapo. I live in the eastern side of Rarotonga Island in the Pacific, which is about 3 hours flight from Tahiti and 6 hours flight north to Hawaii. We have had self-government since 1965, but for some purposes we are still under New Zealand, so we're not fully independent. I spent a lot of time in New Zealand doing education, returned to the Cook Islands in 1992 and have lived here ever since with the odd overseas break. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks so much for being here. And so I'm very interested in hearing from you. The idea is to give the audience some idea of what it's like to be a Cook Islander. We, from the rest of the world, are aware that the Cook Islands is one of the places that's being strongly considered and is moving towards possibly allowing deep sea mining. And I know that you're very involved in that discussion. And I think people who listen to this podcast, like me, know almost nothing about the Cook Islands and are interested in hearing the different sides of the story and hearing what it's like from a real Cook Islander. With that audience in mind, how do you describe where you are, who you are, and especially your relationship to the ocean?
So we're an archipelago of 15 islands, 3 of them uninhabited. Pretty well 6 are in the northern group, and they are traditional coral atolls. So they're very low to sea level. The little islands form a circle around a central lagoon, and then you have the larger ocean outside. And in those islands, life is very traditional. You rely a lot on the sea for your daily protein from fish or seafood. Shipping is infrequent. Even airplanes in this day of fuel crisis are not regular. And so life continues on almost in a traditional manner there. The best thing that's happened is connectivity, so that people could stay in touch on the internet. In the southern group islands, we're different geography. We have volcanic islands formed by extinct volcanoes, and then in the middle there are islands which are a combination of the two. So there's been volcanic activity which has caused upheaval of coral islands, and then also there's the reef that's uplifted has formed part of the island. Rarotonga itself is got hills, what we call the mountains, of about 1,000 meters, and that's the highest point. And there's no road across the central area because it's too difficult to put in. So the 2 roads circle around the island. And in Rarotonga, we're very dependent upon tourism for about 60% of our GDP. And so having a clean, green environment is very important to our tourists. It's competitive tourism. There are many islands with tropical temperatures and palm trees and coconut trees, but to us, I think that our cultural aspect is very interesting for our visitors. Most of the visitors come from New Zealand, Australia, and we have a cooler period right now, and so we get them coming between, say, May and August. And then in the off season, which is November, December, January, February, we get northern visitors from the United States and a lot from Canada as well. And then we have Europeans who do the round world trip. Typically they'll go Germany, Singapore, New Zealand, Rarotonga, Los Angeles, and then back to or Hawaii, back to Europe. So because of that, our life is less traditional. And to me, we have a good blend of modern lifestyle, but still harking back to the old cultural values, including a clean environment.
Can you put the Cook Islands into the context of the other Pacific islands?
So I've been to some of the other islands, like French Polynesia, where they're a lot more westernized because they are still a French territory. Hawaii is also very westernized because they are a US territory, and they are what I regard as our closest neighbors. Then to the west of us is Samoa, which is still quite traditional, but also relatively developed, and Tonga, which is less developed. Our Prime Minister is very proud to announce that we have graduated on the OECD scale from the sort of lower level to the middle income. We have, free education for everybody. It's quite common for young people to go to university in another country or even participate in distance learning here to get tertiary degrees. So I guess it's, reasonably well off compared to other Pacific Island countries.
And you went to New Zealand for education, and you lived in New Zealand for a while. What did you do there? What did you have? What was your career?
Yes, so at the age of 13, I went away to boarding school and made some good friends. It's like boot camp. And then from there, I went on to university. I first did an arts degree in political studies and French. And then my husband and I went to live in Europe for a couple of years. And then I was in the hotel business. And then my father said to me, those hours that hotel business works are very unsociable. I think you should go back to university and get a more, sensible degree. So I went back and I looked at doing law, but at that time I had a small child, and I looked at what law graduates earned at the end of their training, and it was less than what an accountant got. So I became an accountant. And I did a joke some years ago. It was someone I met on a plane, and I said, well, so then I turned from becoming a mild-mannered accountant to becoming a environmental warrior. And she laughed and said, I don't think you were ever mild-mannered. So, but it was a return to Cook Islands in 1992 when I saw the degradation of the lagoon compared to what I remembered as a child. And then I just became concerned generally about the environment, It's a southern group island, which is fairly high. We're less concerned with sea level rise and climate change impacts like ocean flooding of the coastal areas, and that, occasionally we'll get a king tide, which will cause the seawater to come across the main road. But mostly where my concern I could see was waste management. So then I became a community advocate under the UN Conventions for Chemicals and Waste, with particular interest in waste, environmentally sound waste disposal. It covers all kinds of pollution. So that's my link to the deep sea mining, is my concern about pollution.
Interesting. And so you've been active as an environmental warrior, as you say, since you came back to the Cook Islands and saw how it had changed from the time when you left till you came back?
Not straight away. I tended to keep my opinions to myself. And then as I gained more confidence, when I realized that other people were not seeing what I saw. And then in, I think it was 2005, I was asked to become the president of Ipukarea Society, and it might have been earlier actually. It's more like 2000, I think. And then I said, well, the thing is, I'm not very politically correct, if I speak out straight, and it might not, reflect well upon the society. And they said, no, we want someone like that, because in a small community, typically, you don't want to offend anybody because you're going to run into them tomorrow.
Right.
So how we handle that here is you just look the other way, and you don't see that person until time goes by, and then you can sort of resume communications
until the water goes under the bridge.
Yes, but in a small community, most people do not want to offend other people because then so they might grumble to themselves privately, but they won't speak out. If someone else speaks out, then they will say, "Oh, I support what she says."
Interesting. And when you started at the Ipukarea Society, was deep sea mining already an issue, a potential?
No, I didn't really hear about it until I think 2007 or so. 2007. I was in Europe anyway, and then I saw this reference to a conference on deep sea mining in Ireland. So I took a cheap flight and went across to hear what they had to say. And I got very concerned when they, enthusiastically talked about, vacuuming up these nodules that were so easy to do. And then I became concerned, mildly concerned. It wasn't until 2012 that a professor gave a talk here. He's from I think, an English institution, and he had just been on a survey ship up around our northern group islands. And it was December, so not a lot of people turned up at the evening meeting. And he said, "You've discovered rare earth elements in the mud that lies underneath the nodules." And so the international network that I had been supported by had given me an insight into the chemicals. And so I was aware of, the chemical table and how many of them were, noxious or toxic. And so then, I looked up what rare earths was. I never heard of it before, and realized this was really serious because they were so valuable that until then, deep sea mining probably was not that economic, because the price of the main metal in the nodules had gone down, but the rare earth elements were highly prized, and therefore that would be the incentive for deep sea mining.
Okay, well, before we start talking about the mining and the aspects, I'd just like you to give a bit more context around the island. So what should someone understand about the Cook Islands and Polynesia before we start talking about mining?
Well, there is no word for mining in our native language. So this native language is dialects of it are spoken in the Polynesian Triangle, which extends from New Zealand to Hawaii and east to Chile. So right within that triangle, I, as an Indigenous person, can make myself understood in the language of the people of that land by substituting certain consonants. And so typically we share a basic vocabulary. So when our Deep Sea Mining Authority calls meeting to talk about deep sea mining, people have really little idea of what it involves. They have no idea about terrestrial mining, which the deep sea mining people emphasize terrestrial mining techniques and practices. And we have come to believe that that is not appropriate, because the marine environment is very different from the land environment. On the land, you can remove overburden, have slag piles, and, do remediation after mining. But in the water, it's a much more fluid environment. And how will you stop the pollution caused by either vacuuming or picking up these nodules? How would you stop from spreading within your own jurisdiction and then from spreading to the neighboring jurisdiction, which maybe, does not support deep sea mining? And so that is why I think French Polynesia has come out so strongly. They have equivalent areas to our northern group atolls where the mining is proposed to be carried out. And they, have some nodules, although our Prime Minister scoffs and said, well, they have so much less than we do. But they are very concerned about the impacts of the drift. So when you talk about mining, you are like asking a blind person to describe a picture which they have never seen. They have no idea about colour, structure, anything, because they just have no inkling of what it's about. So we at TIS focus very much on the need for transparency, and I focus particularly on the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, where prior informed consent is important. And I stress the informed part because we consider that our government is not transparent enough when they talk about, and neither are the deep sea mining companies, because they emphasize what they think are the good points, and very rarely, unless we bring it up, do they discuss possible impact.
Joining me today is Kelvin
Passfield.
Can you introduce yourself and give an introduction to where you are and about the society that you're a part of?
I'm in the Cook Islands. I work for the Ipukarea Society, a non-government environmental organisation. I'm actually Australian by birth. Lived out here in the Cook Islands since 1988, coming out as an Australian volunteer, one of those that decided never to go home.
Tell me about the Te Ipukarea Society. Give me some history and background, and what do you guys focus on?
Well, yeah, we're, as I said, an environmental NGO. We were formed in 1996, so we're celebrating our 30th birthday at the end of next week. So that's a bit of a party for us. We focus on the environment, pretty much everything to do with the environment. We do invasive species eradications, bird conservation, climate change work, climate change adaptation, campaigning for ecologically sustainable development. So that's where our deep seabed mining focus comes in. What else? We work with young people. We talk to schools about different environmental issues. Waste management. We do a fair bit with waste management as well, particularly plastic pollution.
Is your focus just the Cook Islands, or are you broader than that in the Pacific?
No, our focus is the Cook Islands. We've done a little bit of work in other countries over the years, but yeah, pretty much Cook Islands focused.
Okay, so you're going to be the first non-government Cook Islander that I've spoken to about the deep sea mining question in the Cook Islands. And I think most people are familiar that Cook Islands is one of the kind of most far ahead jurisdictions in terms of potentially allowing deep sea mining. But I also think that most people like myself know very little about the Cook Islands. We read newspaper headlines saying that, well, amongst other things, that China and the US are both taking a keen interest in what's going on there, and that there's various companies both in the Cook Islands and in the international seabed area that are kind of active in the Cook Islands. So I'm really interested to talk to you and get some local perspective on what the local people are thinking about the potential for deep sea mining in your local waters, and also how the process is appearing to you on the ground, especially who have a sustainable development orientation. Maybe a good place to start is just, what's your stance on deep sea mining in the Cook Islands. I understand you, as an organization, have a moratorium, or support a moratorium, which is different than a ban.
Yeah. I think at the moment we still maintain support for a moratorium on deep seabed mining. The reason being, we would like to go for a ban, but if we say that the mining can't start because we don't know about the level of impacts on deep sea ecosystems, deep sea species at the moment, then we can't really go for a ban, because if they could prove that the impacts on deep sea ecosystems and species was minimal or not worth worrying about, then we wouldn't really have a leg to stand on. We don't think that will ever happen, not in the real world anyway. In the world of environmental impact assessments by companies that want to mine, it's possible that could happen, but and we think the science is coming more and more available to show that the impacts on the deep sea ecosystem would be severe, and therefore we are moving towards changing our stance to supporting a ban. But at the moment, we still maintain the moratorium stance.
Okay, so you've got a principled stance of no deep sea mining that involves significant impacts. And then, so if you couple that with the expectation that there's going to be significant impacts, then that just results in effectively a ban. But your strong stance is tied to not allowing impacts in the marine environment.
Yeah, we've got too much to lose. We're an island nation. You could learn a bit more about the Cook Islands, or I can say that we're 15 islands spread over 2 million square kilometres of the Pacific Ocean, and we're 99.99% ocean. Our EEZ, if you do the ratio between the land area and the ocean area, it's 99.99% ocean. So certainly very, very important to us, and we don't want to see its ability to look after us and feed us and look after the health of the globe, basically. We don't want to see that damaged.
And so your organization, I assume you're very involved in the ongoing discussion process, and I guess part of your role is to not only engage with government agencies, but also with local people and try to educate and inform and participate. So give me an idea of how Cook Islanders see the potential for deep sea mining. How would you describe the kind of local opinion and reaction to the process?
It's a bit of a mixed bag. There's certainly a lot of people who support our stance against deep seabed mining, but there is also another group which are very vocal about wanting deep sea mining to occur. They're a small group, but they're quite vocal on social media. If ever we're trying to explain things about the risks of deep sea mining, then they'll always pipe up about the fact that we've got to get this money. God gave us these resources to use, not to be left sitting on the bottom of the ocean. These sorts of arguments. We want Cook Islanders to come back home to the Cook Islands. So we want a healthy economy, and they think a seabed mining industry could give a healthy economy. So there's those other sides of the story, both sides of the story. And it's hard to say that the government's Seabed Minerals Authority, the government agency for managing deep seabed mining, is quite, in our opinion, they're quite pro-mining. They really want to see the mining happen. They will tell you, and they tell us, that no decision to allow mining has been made, and that decision will be based on science and based on what the exploration phase provides. But at the same time, everything that the government does to us signifies they're moving towards mining. And the mining companies are also anticipating mining. One of the companies has said they want to be mining before the end of this decade, so before 2030. Mm-hmm. And they are also going around having public presentations to the villages all around the country to explain why they think mining would be good for the country and what they're doing about it.
Yeah, I imagine that this is the case for the deep sea mining conversation everywhere, but I imagine in the Cook Islands where there is an ongoing community consultation process. And I understand that I guess I just get the perception that because you're such a small population that the potential and because it's such a major issue for people there. So it's a little bit comparable to Norway, especially what you say about it, people having the impression that the authority in charge of regulating it seems to have a very pro mining stance. I think that's also the perception that a lot of people here in Norway have, that Norwegian equivalent of the Seabed Minerals Authority is pushing really hard to get this industry going. And I imagine for similar reasons. They want economic diversification and kind of a new industry. But am I right in thinking that in the Cook Islands it's a big conversation? Like, are most Cook Islanders aware of this and opinionated about it?
I'd say most Cook Islanders are aware of it, and a lot of them are opinionated about it. Not everybody. Some of them just have too much going on in their lives to worry about something that may never happen. But there's a lot of people who do know about seabed mining, and we've done as good a job as we can to educate them, as has the Seabed Minerals Authority and the mining companies. They always giving their views on deep sea mining and educating the people. So I'd say we've got a very well-aware community overall.
And then how divided is opinion in the Cook Islands on deep sea mining? Is there a meaningful sense of what the community thinks about deep sea mining, or is opinion too diverse to speak of kind of one community opinion?
No, I think that the suggestion was made 2 nights ago at the meeting that really the best way is to stop this divisive issue from polarizing our society is have a referendum about it. So, for us, that's a risk as well, because typically in a referendum, you have a lot of politicking going on. At least a person would be able to vote in private without anyone looking over their shoulder to say whether they agreed with it or not, or, whether they were strongly against it or strongly for it. And I used the example at the meeting 2 nights ago when we developed the legislation in 2009 called the Deep Sea Minerals Act. That our parliament was made available to anybody who wanted to go in there and make a statement, written or verbal, in English or in their native language, because obviously at Parliament you have translators as a matter of course. And so I went as a group, and then I went as an individual, and many other people did too. And you have the opportunity now, since we can do video conferencing, anybody could go along there and make a time and do an interview like this. So, if you are really wanting to be transparent and collect all the opinions that you could to support your argument, it's possible to do it that way. And I was very pleased at our community meeting the other night. Not one person supported deep sea mining. So maybe only us diehards turned out in the cold evening, but one man said he was a fence sitter, but he needed reassurance, and all the other speakers said, we don't support it. I was very happy about that, because usually there's some fool who was often male who will say, let's just dig it up. It's not doing us any good. But it's been 70 years since this discussion started, and I want to enjoy the benefits now. One time, one of the pillars in society here is the religious advisors, and they say, God put the nodules there for us to benefit, so, let's not be stupid and just dig them up and use them. And I think the more common sense approach is you have plenty of other resources. We have a good lifestyle here. There is no serious poverty like you get in other countries. We own our land through the traditional system. So you don't have a lot of foreigners coming and taking up your land like they have in Hawaii and New Zealand and Tahiti. And if you are hungry, it's because you're too lazy to pick the fruit that grows so easily here, or to grow food. But even so, people here will be charitable and say, you're hungry because you're lazy, but here, take this in the meantime. And I think that kind of community attitude comes from in adverse times, like in a cyclone, you have to pull together and you have to help each other. And that is the resilience of an Indigenous lifestyle. You really cannot stand by and watch someone else starve to death. It's not acceptable. And so that's one of the nicest things I rediscovered when I returned some 30 years ago to live here, is that, humanity that people have for each other when it comes down to the difficult decisions.
So you're saying that the Cook Islanders live a much more traditional lifestyle than in other Pacific Islands even, but certainly than in other parts of the world. And whereas some people would see that as an impoverished lifestyle, and then a turn to extracting the deep sea resources would be, beneficial, move people up the development ladder, that the traditional lifestyle in the Cook Islands is sufficient. There's enough. There's no reason to go and in your mind risk the destruction of the way things are when the traditional lifestyle, and that's very interesting.
We feel that it is sufficient. Another thing about the so-called economic returns from deep sea mining is, having travelled and been exposed to other cultures, it is typical of extractive industries that the people who live in the country where all the mineral wealth is very rarely benefit. There might be a handful of people, but in general, most people do not get any benefits from it. So that's the first lesson I've read upon, looking at impacts of extractive industries on people's lifestyles. Secondly, the International Seabed Authority meeting that I attended, this idea of what the returns would be and how they would be distributed. So at the time, we were still talking about the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. Companies have obtained claims to explore, and this is still in the common area of the ocean, so areas beyond national jurisdiction. And they were saying, so this is the for the benefit of all mankind. So if we base it on a per capita distribution, the Pacific is so tiny, less than half of 1% would be distributed to Pacific Islands. And immediately I thought, the Pacific Islands get very little, and other countries that are more numerous will get more. I don't think that is acceptable if people fully understand it. So these benefits that people talk about, first of all, you're going to get distributed less than 1%. And then, of course, the mining company would want a return upon its investment. And typically they have a mother company somewhere, and then they have subsidiary companies in each of the jurisdictions where they carry out extractive activities. So, each unit's got to make money on its own. Mm-hmm. And I read with interest, recently Norway has passed or suggested legislation that the parent company should equally be liable as the subsidiary company in the event of environmental accident. And I keep in mind very much the environmental accident that happened in the Gulf of Texas, when they had a mining rig, and I think it was for oil, and there was a huge problem. It took several years to sort out. And I just said, well, it's not our problem, we're sorry, but there's nothing we can do about it. And so I feel very strongly I don't want that to happen in my area. where you say, look, I'm sorry, I really didn't mean this problem to happen, but it has happened. There's nothing we can do about it.
Can you describe what that process of consent is like in the Cook Islands? It's
Yes.
not like you could invite everybody into one big meeting at the main town hall because everyone is so spread out. So how does that work? Are there different meetings on each island and a traveling consultation process?
That's right. And it's very expensive. And at the meeting we attended 2 nights ago, people from the Northern Group Atoll spoke how they were there on the island when the government consultation took place. And again, they just talked about the money aspect. We're going to reap the benefits of these nodules that God gave us sitting at the bottom of the ocean and not doing us any good now. So we're going to make use of them and we're all going to have this fabulous lifestyle. And so they were disquieted because they again thought, wait a minute, it's common sense that if you disturb the bottom of the ocean, then the fishing will be disturbed. Our government comes back and says, oh, no, the fish are in the top 200 metres from the surface, and this mining is going on 1.5 kilometres below the surface. However, in our role as NGOs, we look at the research that resulting plume of pollution could affect plankton upon which small life forms feed. And then in the chain of bigger creatures eat the smaller creatures. And so if a whale, for instance, did not have the plankton available because it's been smothered by the plume generated by deep sea mining, then, the whales would not have any food and they would starve or move. And sharks similarly would not have the smaller fish to feed upon. It's common sense to understand it will have a knock-on effect, but the community meetings that take place either do not mention any impact on fish and fishing, or they minimize it by saying there's not really a problem. But in our opinion, no one has really done much research on the way the currents work in the Pacific. So at different levels, at very low levels, the current might flow one way, and at the next level up, similar to the winds in the atmosphere, they blow in the opposite direction. So the current might move in the other way. Fishing is a major source of income, not because they have their own fisheries fleets, but because they give rights to foreign fishing boats to come in their EEZ and fish. So typically, most of the fish is centered around the equator, and we point out, why would you put at risk such a valuable resource that contributes maybe 15 to 20% of the Cook Islands economy and a bigger share of other countries. The foreign fishing vessels pay license fees, and then they're supposed to pay a per kilo amount of fish landed to the country where they are fishing in the EEZ. Why would you put that at risk for something that's so unproven and experimental as deep sea mining?
So is it this specific concern about the plume and the potential toxicity that's in the plume affecting the fish and that affecting the fishing and the other mammals? Or is it a more general concern about lack of complete understanding and a perception of not being completely transparent? Like, if the science was done thoroughly and demonstrated to you that the plume settles out quickly, or it doesn't spread, or there's no transfer up into the higher water columns, would that make you rest easy about deep sea mining, or is it something more general and more vague?
No, I think common sense tells you if you change anything on the seabed, again, I hark back to the training I got in the chemical conventions where sediment settles on the seabed, and if you disturb it, you're going to disturb the toxics that have been sitting in that seabed. You mess with that and it starts dispersing. Not a good thing. And then the other approach is, it's a very big ocean in the Pacific. In the UN, the Pacific comes into the large group of Asia and Pacific, and we'd like be the tail end of this rather large group. And we've always had different concerns than the larger land-based Asia countries like China and Korea and stretches as far as the Arab countries like Oman. And so I'm used to having to present the alternative view to, what a land-based country might agree upon. So this is huge. And I got fed up with reading United Nations reports that would go on for several pages about issues in Asia. And there'd be this little paragraph at the end in the Pacific that said, there are no adverse effects because there has been no research. So, everything must be okay. And I felt very strongly that on the 2 points, there's not enough science, there's not enough commitment to the science. And so, ideally, I would want a total ban on deep sea mining, but the more political acceptable line to take is the moratorium. If we had the support of other countries in the world to have a moratorium until more is known about how the currents in the Pacific operate, that's what the more practical view that we will support.
I want to hear a little bit more about how the community engagement process is in the Cook Islands. I've spoken with the Seabed Minerals Authority, and they have described how they're engaging in, that their approach to community engagement is world leading. So I guess I'm just interested in how, if community members are going to decide this, how do you manage to get community members informed enough to make a decision on something that is so consequential and so unknown?
So, in our view, we as civil society organisations have to play a very big role in providing more information on some of the adverse impacts. And then the deep sea mining people come out and it's almost a little act that they do where, they take turns presenting, and in my mind, there's appearance and there's reality. So the appearance is, all these lovely young people who are mostly Cook Islanders are coming out to tell us about this marvellous resort. But as someone said at the meeting 2 nights ago, I take it that, you as the Deep Sea Mining Authority are in favour of deep sea mining because you talk so positively about it. And they'd said, no, we can't take sides. We are the regulatory agency. So I thought, well, there's your first lie. Or it might not even be a lie. They may genuinely believe it. This is what their bosses have told them to say. So I, give them the benefit of a doubt. So then I brought up the investor-state dispute resolution thing where other countries like Canada and Mexico and Papua New Guinea, closer to home, have been taken to court by the company because the company wants to carry on its polluting activities. And they take the view that, your process has actually led us to hold a reasonable belief that we will be allowed to get a license. We've ticked all the boxes that you have set out, and so there's no reason why you should refuse us a license to go ahead and start mining. So the young woman, they decided, would answer my question, said, well, our role is as making policy is to plug the gaps. As a gap arises, then we will find a situation, that will deal with it. And I said, so this case in Mexico is 5 years old. You've seen the gap. What are you doing to plug it? And she said, oh, well, that's for the government to tell us. And I thought, no, you told me you developed the policies and you're supposed to advise your government people as to the impacts. How, the government members are not all particularly well educated. They have to have a wide but not very deep knowledge of many different topics. So you are supposed to be their policy advisors. Why are you not pointing this out? And she was unable to answer. This is, again, the appearance and the reality. they trot out these sayings that their bosses have taught them to respond with, but they're not answering the question. And I don't think either that they are taking note of what the audience is saying. I saw no one writing down notes. There was no recording of the meeting. So if you were to draw up a report, a summary of the evening's events were, you're relying on somebody's memory, rather than taking steps to ensure accuracy by like filming it or recording it in some way. So I do distrust. I think these meetings are called to so that they can tell the public in general and in the international fora, we've held all these consultative meetings and people sat there nodding.
So what you've got is different kind of quarters all trying to educate a population to make a decision, but the information isn't in. It's not like there's a textbook that you can give everybody and say, these are the facts on deep sea mining. This is the potential impact. This is what the economics are going to be. I imagine that everybody's kind of got different perceptions of all of these. And so there must be part of this process is dealing with a lot of uncertainty and dealing with a lot of conflicting narratives about what the future would look like.
Yeah, I think you said something just then that about the population getting opportunity to make a decision. Well, I think the problem here is it's not going to be the population that makes that decision. It's going to be the government that makes the decision. They made a specific point a few years ago about changing the legislation around seabed mining, that decisions would be made about mining to be in the national interest, when the previous wording in the legislation was decisions would be in the public interest. So to us,
Really?
that means the public could have a say. Like, we could have a petition, we could have a rally, we could show that the majority were against deep seabed mining, but the government could still say, well, sorry, but we're the government, you elected us, and in the national interest, we think this is a good idea, so we're going to allow it to happen. We pointed out why we didn't want that law changed, and they still went through and changed it. I think with that very obvious reasoning behind that change, it was very calculated.
Is there a deep sea mining regulation on the books in the Cook Islands? I think I read that there was something, you had something in 2009 and then it was updated in 2019. This is what you're referring to?
Yeah, we had a Seabed Mining Act in 2009. Actually, one of the consultants that came through said that was a very, very environmentally concerned act, and they thought that the environmental conditions contained in that act would mean that no mining company would ever come here to mine. They could never satisfy the requirements. But so that's all been thrown out, and they've done a new one. And even that one was changed again later on for between this public and national interest. To be honest, I can't remember if it was the act that was changed or whether it was the changes to the Environment Act, which were made to suit deep sea mining operations in future where this happened. But yeah, we do have a current 2019 Act. We also have seabed exploration regulations, which is what the 3 companies now exploring in the Cook Islands are exploring under that legislation. I think maybe 2 years ago now, or between a year and 2 years ago, the government already passed the exploitation regulations. So they've already passed the mining regulations to govern mining when it happens. To us, that also signifies governments made their decision. Why else would they have the mining regulations already in place? And meanwhile, the International Seabed Authority is still struggling, trying to get the right environmental care over the seabed mining regulations that they're supposed to come up with, which is why some of the companies like the metals company are now knocking on the door of the USA for unilateral rights to mine.
Well, this is interesting in terms of what you're saying about noticeable shift in not only the kind of perception of the government, but also in the wording of the legislation. So one of the things that I pick up in the Norwegian conversation, I guess I would just say there's a lack of trust between the people who are being asked to support the mining regulations, the mining regime as it's laid out, and the people who are going to oversee that regime. In the Norwegian situation, it's not necessarily that there's anything written down in the laws that is specifically, problematic, but you have to trust the government to interpret the laws and to use the brakes that have been built into the legislation. And my perception in Norway is that the people, because the government seems to be so enthusiastic about getting this industry up off the ground, that it's the trust in that the government people would put the stop to it if the environmental data came back in the wrong way. So tell me about how you see the trust piece in the Cook Islands. I can't help but feel like in a small place, I would imagine there's more trust. There must just be more communication, more knowing people on a more personal level, and that would engender trust. But tell me how you see that.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is an issue being a small country. For those listening that don't realise how small we are, although we've got a big, like I said, 2 million square kilometre ocean area, we've only got a population of less than 20,000 people, and about maybe 12,000 to 13,000 of those are actually Cook Islanders. There's a reasonable expatriate or foreign worker population servicing the tourism industry, which is quite big here as well. So yeah, a very small place. Everybody does know everybody. I mean, in the end, you have to draw a line between your personal life and your
interesting
your opinions on deep seabed mining. Apart from having a bit of a joke about it sometimes, which we also do, about the differences. I'm sure everybody, within government also thinks their reasons are for the benefit of the country. It's not like we think they're bad people, They're trying to do the wrong thing, it's just that they have a different value system for, parts of the environment that we're more concerned about. And, we don't really trust the government to stop mining if the, I guess the question is what level of impact is going to be too great. And again, our opinion of what level of environmental damage would probably be a lot less than what someone from the Seabed Minerals Authority would have, or the Prime Minister would have, on what's acceptable and the extent of damage. Plus, it's going to be very hard to measure anyway. Because of that, we push the precautionary approach. If we can't really know, we can't measure, then we do the cautious thing and we just don't do it until we can be sure.
You said at first that they're in favor of deep sea mining, and then you checked yourself and said that maybe they're not. But why do you think it's that way? Why isn't it that people who are skeptical of the process aren't in that authority?
Well, leading on from that idea of just holding these meetings as window dressing, so you can tell the world. We went out to the communities and everyone's happy with it, even if people express opinions that show they're not happy with it or they're undecided, they still tell the world that this is fine. So then I, being a suspicious person, thought it's quite common for regulatory agencies to be captured by the very companies that they are supposed to be regulating. And I can think of the security SEC in the United States, and even to some extent in the United Nations. CSOs say the United Nations agency that's responsible for regulating this particular area has been captured by them. So there's an element of that. Then you have many Cook Islanders who are educated, but at lower levels of responsibility. And then at the most key point, you have a foreigner who's in league. So currently we have someone on the Deep Sea Mining Authority who worked for the Nautilus company in Papua New Guinea, which is became defunct and is now known as the Metals Company. In your henhouse, the fox is right there. And he's high up and he's telling you how to do things. And you think, well, I guess if I don't do what he says, next week I may not have a job. So, I can understand how people will just go along with it. But I do think that capture by the deep sea mining authorities is a concern. Here, the deep sea mining representatives that have lived here for several years, now they are being very subtle about introducing themselves into the cultural world. So I find that people who were very strongly against the issue of nuclear testing in the Pacific Ocean, in the 1980s, those activists, some of them, this is a similar issue as far as I can see, but they are in favor of the deep sea mining. And then I look a little further and you find that they are getting little grants, small cash grants to carry out cultural activities. And then the deep sea mining companies become the purse for when we have our annual celebrations, which are in the form of what are they called, dance competitions, and they provide the prize money. So there's these little tentacles going right through your society in small amounts, but very effectively spreading the good news about how you're going to benefit from deep sea mining.
Interesting. So I guess you're pointing towards some power imbalances where you have a population that is not adequately informed, and
That's
you
right.
have people who have the money who are able to put their fingers on the scales in small ways.
So the mining companies have got the money to get the PR angle that they need to do, the spin. They've got the money to pay the lawyers to take you to court if you don't agree. There's this asymmetric balance between the mining companies and their vast wealth and these, tiny little people on a small island that no one else really cares about.
Okay, so then tell me about your thoughts on the drivers of the push to deep sea mine in the Cook Islands areas. I heard the narrative that tourism was really hard impacted by COVID, and so the idea to invest in deep sea mining was kind of important to diversify the economy of the Cook Islands, that you can't be so dependent on tourists who might stop coming from one year to the next, and it's important to have multiple different sources. I thought it was interesting what you said about how there's also the drive to have more Cook Islanders return home. I understand that there's a large kind of population of Cook Islanders who live in Australia and New Zealand. And so interesting that the economic piece also ties into that if you had more economic opportunities locally, then maybe more people would be able to live where they maybe want to live. So that's interesting. But tell me your thoughts on the reasons, the economic situation, and whether they're good enough reasons, and how you weigh the trade-offs to the environmental risks.
Yeah, you're right that the main industry is tourism. We are very potentially over-reliant on tourism, and COVID did show that. But and COVID did provide government with an excuse to push the seabed mining a bit harder. But the decision was made well before COVID to be pushing for deep seabed mining. This has been like you said, we had the first Seabed Mining Act back in 2009, and government's been pushing for seabed mining ever since. They issued tenders for exploration back about, I don't know, maybe 2015 or something, or before that. The only problem was they never got any bids. Nobody was interested then. I think the price of cobalt was down below 27,000 or something per tonne. At some stage it went up to about $80,000 a tonne, and then that's about the time they issued the last tender for licences, and they got 4 or 5 applications at that stage, and they gave 3 out. Since then the cobalt price has come back down again. So the viability of the industry is always dependent on the price of the minerals that they're going to get. But yeah, we are heavily reliant on tourism. Diversification would be a good idea. But there's other ways, there's other places to diversify, and government could maybe put a few more resources towards looking at those rather than spending all their money on looking at deep seabed mining. We've got an offshore banking industry which does very well. I think it's the second biggest income earner for the country. No environmental impact at all on our environment. It may have maybe dodgy things about it. I'm not sure. I mean, the whole tax haven story. But I think the Cook Islands has got a good reputation for just staying above the law in that regard, and maybe government could do a lot more to promote more of that. More money coming in and no impact on the environment, as an example.
Just to change subjects a little bit, so some people raise there's a climate paradox relating to deep sea mining, especially for Pacific Islands. So you said that Cook Islands is less exposed to climate change risk than other Pacific nations. Would you say you're still more exposed to climate change risk than those of us in big continental countries?
I think the climate change exposure depends on your geography. So the southern group islands are less exposed, but the northern group atolls definitely are fearful of the impacts of climate change. And then we talk about using solar power, which requires metals like cobalt and manganese and things like that.
I think that's somewhere that a lot of people go. Is there's a trade-off, there's a balance here. If we're going to need minerals in order to come up with alternative technologies to mitigate climate change, how do you balance between the risk to the Northern Islands of potential climate change versus the benefits of using these minerals into climate change mitigation technologies?
Well, I think the battery people themselves have moved on, and they're less dependent upon cobalt, because it was difficult to obtain. The other biggest supplier in the world is the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's difficult to get the stuff there. And they've moved on and have developed batteries that do not require these metals. Another issue that has come up very strongly in the last month or so has been people object to these critical minerals being used for weapons of war. They really don't want to be part of the war machine. So typically the REE's elements are used in communications, so what helps you pinpoint areas for bombing. People are very unhappy about that, and somebody raised and said, we would not want it to be used for, the purposes of war. We had a similar context with plastics. Some of the plastics, they use toxic materials for durability. And they said, oh no, we can't possibly trace these minerals through the supply chain. And they said, rubbish. Somebody writes a specification for the plastic. You know exactly what the recipe is. Therefore, you know what goes into it. You know the cost and the source of it because you did the contract. So for me, that's a similar situation for the deep sea mining minerals. You know where you got it from. You know who you sold it to. So to say that you cannot track it through the supply chain is rubbish. To get back to the idea about the climate change and how we're mitigating it by using the minerals that we take from the seabed, I think, first of all, it's been demolished, that idea, because the technology of battery storage for solar purposes has moved on. So why would you despoil your environment for which the benefit has already passed? Now the battery companies are using other more easily obtainable minerals. So there's no need.
So I guess you don't see that the trade-off problem exists in the way that people frame it as a problem. The costs and benefits aren't there in the way that they're often represented. Is that what you're saying?
Well, again, using the wider extractive industries scenarios, we are unwilling to be the sacrificial lamb, if you like, for the benefit of the rest of the world. We had an underwater minerals conference a couple of years ago, and there was a fellow from Impossible Metals who was going on about how they were going to do these robots that they had used on Mars to just pick these nodules up and not even touch the sea floor.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately I said, well, how do you get your robot down to that level? Oh, well, similar to a submarine, we'd be, using seawater as ballast. And I said, when you get to the bottom and you're done picking up your nodules, and then you use the, release of the water to raise your submersible, is that not going to, create a plume as well? Oh, he didn't want to talk about that. I didn't get a straight answer. Probably never occurred to him. So no, we do not want. So then I said, this is an experimental way of getting minerals. There are other places closer to the United States where these minerals exist. Like Martha's Vineyard, there's a big field just not far from there. Why don't you try it out there first? In that way you have MIT handy to give you information if you need it, but you do it there first. And we'll see how unpolluting an activity it is, privately, I thought, and whether the people who live in Martha's Vineyard, who've got more money than me, how they would feel about having their waters polluted. Unfortunately, that may have formed a reason why the Trump administration is now going into other U.S. territories in the Pacific, like the Mariana Islands and American Samoa, and say, right, well, we're going to mine within our own EEZ, instead of, going to foreign jurisdictions. So there's a little, unexpected downside to that one.
So the question that I try to ask everybody who comes on the podcast is around the framing of deep sea mining as a difficult trade-off question. And that's certainly one of the narratives that speaks to a lot of people in the deep sea mining conversation, is that, well, these minerals are necessary or beneficial or valuable anyway for human society, but there's going to be environmental harms and ecological risks. And we have to, as a humanity or as a society or as a country in your case, make a trade-off decision about how to weigh the risks against the benefits. I want to ask you how you see that trade-off framing, if that's a legitimate frame, and then how we make decisions within that. But I also think that what you've already said is an interesting answer, just in terms of, instead of looking at a trade-off between two things, you're already bringing in additional things and saying, okay, there are other options to deep sea mining that we should also include into the picture. And I think that's interesting to look at how people describe a problem and how many variables they put into the equation.
I think the answer to that lies in what I said earlier on about we're 99.99% ocean. So how much of a risk do we want to take on causing damage to that? It's not like it's a little part of our ocean, although government and the mining companies do say we only want to mine these small areas, but you don't know what the impact of mining a small area will be. The drift of the plumes, for example, the potential extinctions of some species down there that we don't even know what role they play in the ecosystem. I mean, one of the things the government was saying for years was it's a biological desert down there. There's nothing down there to worry about because there's nothing living down there. And fortunately, we've had a couple of research cruises come through, and we had the Nautilus come through last year from NOAA, and a lot of underwater video footage of amazing marine life down there. So the whole theory of there's nothing down there to be worried about just has gone out the door. So they have to change their story about that. And as I say, we don't know what those species are. We don't know what role they play in the ecosystem. We don't know what other benefits we could get from those species. There's biomedical research that could be done. I don't want to flog a dead horse, but people often say cures to cancer could be down there amongst some of these organisms that live down there. We just don't know. So a lot more time needs to be spent to gather the information. And then the other side of the story is, do we? Well, they originally said that this whole deep sea mining was for the green transition. We need these minerals for batteries, for the electric cars of the world, and all the other things that we're using. But since then, the whole technology's been evolving, and now they're talking about sodium phosphate or sodium batteries, which they say by the end of 2026, they will be available at the same price of a lithium-ion battery. They'll produce at least the same energy density by then as a lithium-ion battery, and the minerals they need to make these batteries don't come from 5 kilometres down in the deep ocean. So what's the justification for even considering keeping on going after this? And that's when the story comes back around to the critical minerals and the use of these minerals for military purposes, and the fact that China has got the cornered the market on them, and now the US is trying to catch up, and we're becoming a part of this geopolitical tug of war, but no longer for the energy transition. Even the mining companies are changing their story and not talking about the energy transition anymore, and talking more about security, military, etc.
Is the experience of being in the middle of a geopolitical tug of war, is that palpable on the Cook Islands? That's, I would say, in terms of the international news, that is like the biggest headline that I think people are aware of, that, there was a memorandum of understanding signed with China, and New Zealand got a little bit incensed about that. And then there's been, I don't think an actual MOU signed with the United States, but certainly something in that realm. And so this is, I think you're describing it as a geopolitical tug of war, kind of fits the way that us outsiders have. And so I wonder if that's something that you notice, or if that is something that, is in the international news, but isn't really actually a local phenomenon.
No, it was very much a local phenomenon for sure. When Cook Islands signed the agreements with China, New Zealand spat the dummy. I don't know if we use that term where you are, but they spat the dummy, and they withheld $30 million of budgetary support that they would normally have given to the country based on that. The Prime Minister was talking about the Cook Islands becoming fully independent and having their own passports, because at the moment, as something we haven't mentioned yet, all Cook Islanders have New Zealand passports. They're all New Zealand citizens, except me, I'm an Australian citizen. But those sorts of things really concerned the people. The people didn't want to give up their New Zealand citizenship, their access to medical services in New Zealand. They get referrals to New Zealand for serious medical concerns, all sorts of things. So the people were very upset with that. So basically the government of the Cook Islands and New Zealand sorted it out. The Cook Islands agreed to some pretty significant compromises and signed off on it, and now everything's rosy again. That was done partly because this is an election year, and the ruling government was probably pretty concerned that to have people upset with them because of putting their relationship with New Zealand at risk wasn't a healthy situation to be in with an election coming up.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating how immediately and palpably that was felt by the locals. So as part of those news stories that I read, I saw that New Zealand withheld the budgetary support that you mentioned, but that didn't come across how meaningful that is to the locals. And so I guess that's just a good reminder of how these kind of big geopolitical news headlines that we sometimes think are mostly about, conflicts between Trump and Xi actually have very immediate effects on people on the ground. Give me an idea of how you see the future could play out. So, I mean, Cook Islands is very much in the middle of this process. Like you say, there is regulations on the books. The government appears to be, quite set on giving this industry a go, one way or another. I guess what's like an optimistic outcome from your perspective? What's a realistic outcome? What do you hoping to see over the next 5 and 15 years?
Now, I think my personal feeling is that the decision on mining won't be an environmental one. It'll be an economic one. And if there's money to be made, seriously, the mining, they'll find a way to make it happen, or they'll do their best to make it happen. If the economics isn't there, I can't see the mining companies investing in going down 5 kilometres deep to mine up resources which are only worth $10,000 a tonne and will never make a profit. So I think there's that side of it. There's the other side of it is these other mining companies that are springing up left, right and centre these days, calling for access to exploration rights in high seas areas, in US territories or whatever. And I wonder if they're serious or if they're just looking at hyping up the whole thing, becoming a company, getting investors to push up the value of their shares on the stock market and then get out. Because I think if all these companies seriously started to mine, again, the price of the commodity would have to drop. Supply and demand scenario. There'd be so much cobalt and manganese and nickel coming out of the ocean that it'll be just worthless as a commodity. So I think that's where I see the one possibility going.
Do you see that phenomenon of companies that don't appear to have a real actual interest in mining? Is that something that you see happening domestically, like locally in the Cook Islands? Or is that more of an international phenomenon from your standpoint?
Too sure. It's a bit harder. It's less obvious within the country because the companies have invested a fair bit of money, especially Ocean Minerals, which is an American company, Moana Minerals. They've got a local name here. They bought a huge exploration boat. They've done a lot of work. They charter the boat out to other mining companies in the Cook Islands. They've got a relationship with another company, CIC Ocean Research and Odyssey Marine Exploration. Have got shares, so they're all getting combined because I think it's too expensive for them to each have the resources needed to do the research. So they've got one ROV vessel for doing the deep sea work between them all, and that's how Odyssey Marine became a shareholder in Moana Minerals by basically sharing their equipment with them. So there's that happening.
Sorry, let me interrupt you and just ask you to put more detail there. So my understanding, and please correct me, is that there's 3 existing exploration licenses in the EEZ, and so that would be owned by these 3 different companies. And are you saying that those 3 companies are now kind of pulling together and acting more like one company in order to share costs and synergize?
Well, 2 of them are the CIC, which is related to Odyssey Marine Exploration, and Moana Minerals. They're a part of this whole merger that is just in the process of happening with another company with Albanese as the chair, ex-Rio Tinto chair. And I think the American Ocean Minerals Limited, it might be called. I can't remember the name of the company, but they're merging. So they will become one part of one big company. That's my understanding. I could be wrong, but I think that's what's happening. Yep. That would leave the other company, which is the Cook Islands government joint venture company with a Belgian company, Global Seabed Resources, still operating. But they have done very little in the way of research so far. There's been some changes. GSR, the Belgian company, is pulling out, and a new company is coming in to be the joint venture partner. But it's complicated because they've got a joint venture arrangement within the Cook Islands for Cook Islands Minerals, but also in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone under the International Seabed Authority. I think the one within the Cook Islands is maybe falling apart, and they're going to get a new joint venture partner, but GSR are still involved with the Cook Islands government joint venture for the Clarion-Clipperton zone.
How do you feel about the Cook Islands being, in some ways, a leader on deep sea mining, one of the jurisdictions that is kind of known to be out ahead of other countries globally? Do you see that as posing a risk to the sort of moral authority that Pacific Islands tend to have in climate negotiations?
Yes, I feel ashamed that our government boldly is pursuing this idea. Sometimes I give them the benefit of doubt and think, oh, it's because they are ignorant of the, likely impacts, and they haven't, considered the downside at all sufficiently. I am very concerned, not only because other countries in the Pacific consider it morally indefensible that you could contemplate proceeding with this mining, which might very well impact other nations close by who are not of, similar economic well-being. Which kind of image do you want to project? Some country that is considerate of its neighbours' well-being as well as its own? Or this, Boy Scout gung-ho idea of we want to be the first to do this and just watch how we go. It's kind of proud and defiant. And I know I'd rather be considerate of another country because as an islander, when something bad happens in another country, generally our small community will get together and send what we can. There'll be a fundraiser and we send them whatever funds we are raising, however small they are. But the main thing is you have contributed to help them out in times of need, on the understanding that when you yourself are in need, they will do the same thing.
Yeah, are there traditions of ocean stewardship in the Cook Islands culture that you think should inform decisions about the deep sea? And how do you see these traditions being connected to the deep sea mining regulation and discussion?
So how I explain it to people is we have in our old ways a tradition called Rahui. So Rahui means to notate. Initially, it started off when it was perceived that, the fish or the food supplies from the coastal waters were diminishing. So they would, a chief would set a ban and say nobody is to take from this area for the next, for the next season to allow it to regenerate. And the penalties were severe. You could be killed for not observing it. If someone ratted on you, now we have Christianity, we don't kill each other with impunity, but it's still, regarded as very, very bad form if you don't do it. However, in the modern day, people are now say, you cannot stop me from taking in this area of your village because you are not supported by the law. So a recent discussion we had is that we need the backing of the law to support the traditional setting aside of marine protected areas to allow regeneration. Another development on that ancient scenario is we found that in 1998, we did about 8 marine protected areas on the island of Rarotonga. In the other outer islands, they continued with the tradition anyway, but it had fallen into disuse in Rarotonga. The area living around the area had to say, okay, we will forego fishing in this 300-metre stretch of the lagoon, and we will fish around the other areas. We found someone breaking the tradition. I said, you have no right at all, because under the law, I'm allowed to take this seafood, but he's from a different village, so no consequences to him by his neighbours or anything. So as a consequence of that, one of the leaders said, no, this is going to be a permanently closed area. And people grumbled, and then we pointed out It's been shown that we had our Ministry of Marine Resources do an inventory of sea life before we started, then an inventory after a 2-year period after they had been opened up, and it was actually worse. There was less sea life available after the 2-year period than at the beginning. We're only talking about 2% of the entire island reef. You'd still have 98% to fish how you want. And so now I say to people, we have to do a similar thing with the areas outside the island, outside the reef. So we did not have the resources to go very deep back in the old days. Only recently has the technology enabled people to go down 1.5 kilometres below the ocean. I think that in Indigenous knowledge, there is a sort of scientific aspect based on observations over a long period. And so we didn't really have that to do with the seabed, but we have traditions to do with the migratory animals such as tuna and whales and the usefulness of sharks. So we explain to them the benefits of having the area outside your island as a marine protected area, because in the long run, you're the one that will benefit. If not you, your children and grandchildren. So you bring in the intergenerational aspects. And so we are still on that line. My colleague has just gone to French Polynesia this week to have a discussion with French Polynesian colleagues who do have the backing of the police to support their coastal communities, to discuss. The one last point is we have what's called the Marae Moana Act in the Cook Islands, which was passed in 2017, guaranteeing that you could not carry on activities such as fishing and now mining within, I think, 50 kilometres of each island. So far, in my opinion, that Marae Moana Act has been window dressing. I have never seen anything happen after it was passed. It was delayed for 2 years because the Outer Islands people said, no, we want a 50 kilometre zone, not a 1.5 kilometre zone. We want 50 kilometres to be preserved outside our area because we see the fishing boats at night time coming in closer than that. The 50 kilometre area has been put into law, but I have seen, in my opinion, we have had no progress. It is a paper conservation park, on paper. So I don't see anything coming out of there. We haven't done the surveys that I would have expected. It's just so you can go to the UN and say, hey, look at us, we're doing well. Window dressing.
So this is interesting what you said earlier about there was traditional knowledge and a traditional concept. What did you call it? Rahui? And it sounded like what you were saying was that this traditional concept, this traditional way of preserving and being sustainable had some difficulty in meshing with modern legal concepts. People would say, okay, there's the traditional way of doing this, but you can't enforce that with the law. And now there's reaction to that by trying to put some of these more permanent legal instruments around protecting things. And so this is a very interesting blend of the traditional knowledge and the traditional ways with kind of the more modern legalistic ways. And I think it's interesting what you said about how there's no tradition for deep sea mining. And so there isn't an application, there isn't the traditional knowledge that would safeguard this. And so you've got to extend the traditional concepts out to these new contexts. I think that's a very interesting way to look at things.
Well, see, I don't think that culture is static. Culture evolves over time in response to various things. I just look at our dramatic and dance cultures, how much they have changed. In the 1950s, we had grass skirts that came over your waists. And then over time, we now have grass skirts that tie below your belly button. And this was considered very risque at the time. But bear in mind, Captain Cook sold sailors when they reached Tahiti in 1779 could not believe it that the women came out stark naked onto their ships, and they just paddled out and came on board, and they thought, hallelujah, back home everyone's wearing clothing that covers their bodies, and this is really quite a good idea. So, but that just shows how culture has changed, and I just wanted to use that as an example where culture is not static. And then once you see something else and you develop an ethos, a worldview of how to deal with that. And so I think typically in society you have your front runners, and then your mass, a few more people start to agree with them. Then it takes a while before a whole lot of people agree with them. Before Christianity came, we had a whole lot of, similar to Scandinavia, you had different God. You had the god of war, you had the god of the sea, and all this kind of stuff. What I found in the UN conventions is they brought up ideas that, I didn't necessarily consider before. And then when the idea is introduced, you think about how does it fit in with our society as opposed to our urban society in Europe. And then, you pick out what is relevant to you and what would not work so well. And so that is part of the cultural adaptation, the old saying, adapt or die.
And what you said earlier about how there's suddenly so many new companies and so much activity, and you're not the first person to kind of make suggestions around some of this being pump and dump strategies. And I understand that is something that is also an aspect of just junior mining on land also. So I think it's going to become more and more difficult to keep it all straight and understand who's in it for real and who's in it for less real. I feel like I think I interrupted you when you were giving an overview or your perception of whether the economics are going to be there. You kind of suggested that the best case scenario is rigid environmental protection and rigorous standards, but you didn't sound so optimistic about that, and it sounded like you were thinking that if the economics aren't there, then this is a problem that goes away on its own.
Well, that's what we would hope, yeah. We would hope that these companies which have set up shop over here would pack their bags and go home. But at the moment, they're just digging their heels in, and one of them's opened up another office in another island in Aitutaki already. They're sponsoring local sports teams and other organisations for fundraising for overseas trips, etc. They're really infiltrating the community with a view to winning that social license, I guess it's called, from the people. And yeah, they're doing a good job of it. I mean, they've got the money. There's no shortage of money apparently, so they're splashing it around. And it's going to be very hard for like small NGOs like us and our other colleagues over here to tell the public otherwise. But we'll try. And yeah, we have some support. And if necessary, if it does turn out that the government does approve mining, then I think we would end up in court. We've done it before with the government, and we would do it again.
Interesting. I also think that it's always valuable. These outcomes aren't binary. So having people in the process who are pushing for, the best version of a future, making sure that as much of the decisions get made in a good way and a responsible way and with oversight as possible, that must also be, valuable regardless of how the chips end up falling in the end.
Yeah, I think we're having an impact. Certainly the government has changed the way they're doing things, and the Seabed Minerals Authority is becoming a lot more consultative and making, at least talking about the environment being so important, and that they won't do anything to damage the environment, etc. So don't worry. But in the end, we feel like it's just getting the social license to move forward. The government goes around, the seabed mining companies go around saying, don't worry, we won't damage the environment. If we did, we would stop. But do we really believe them? And no, we don't.
Surely, that's at least a better conversation, having people recognize and affirm the importance of the environment, even if you don't necessarily trust that that's actually their true priority. I hope that ends up incorporating more environmental protection into the outcome. Well, let me ask about, so Cook Island, there's 15 islands. Are they all populated?
No. We've got Tukatea, Manawai, Sawara, 3 unpopulated, and so 12 populated. Rarotonga's got around about 13,000 probably. Aitutaki is around 2,000, and then everywhere else is less than 1,000, mostly less than 200 or 300, some of them. Rakahanga's got about 70 people maybe. Nassau's got about 80. Palmerston's got about 30. So they're the 3 really small ones. The others around 300 or 400.
Is there any difference in opinion about deep sea mining between the different islands? Like, are there some islands or regions that are more opposed or more in favor? Or is it individual based and evenly distributed?
I think the last consultations that the government did, the Seabed Mineral Authority, up in Penryn, the people of Penryn, well, at least some of them spoke out against deep seabed mining. I think that was a bit of a shock for government. They didn't expect that because they figure that when they tell everybody about all the good things that deep sea mining will bring, that they don't expect people to say they don't want it. But that is what happened in Penryn. But then they went on to Manahiki, which is, more for deep seabed mining, because that's where the former Prime Minister, Henry Puna, was from. He was the MP for there, and there's a lot of reasons why you would support the government and the Prime Minister when he's from your island.
Interesting.
As far as benefits that accrue to the island. So they were very much for it, but when even there was some of the travelling party that was doing the presentations were just belittling Penryn Islanders, saying basically those guys don't know what they're talking about because they don't want seabed mining. But you guys, you know the real good things. So, and that's one of the issues is we have a Seabed Minerals Advisory Committee set up by government, and they were set up to provide feedback from the community to the government on what they think about seabed mining. But it's never been like that from the start. They were handpicked because they support deep seabed mining, and the government used them to push seabed mining benefits out to the people. So they go on these trips around the country and tell everybody how good seabed mining is going to be, rather than trying to get feedback, neutral, unbiased feedback from the people themselves. But we've told government this several times, and they deny it. They say, oh, no, that's not true at all. But if you ever went to these meetings, you'd see it's very, very true.
Interesting. I guess I would have assumed that, knowing nothing, I would have assumed that the more rural, the smaller places would be, they would be more economically hard up, and they would be more susceptible to the idea that industry is going to bring economic benefits. That's what I would have guessed. I feel like that's how I think these things map. So it's interesting that you say that, no, in some of these small places, there's people speaking out loudly against, and it's not just a kind of small place, like rural-urban split.
No, definitely not rural-urban split. But as I say, the government's done a good job at, propaganda, basically, about the benefits of seabed mining, the fact that you'll have better health facilities, you'll have better education facilities, you'll have better airports, you'll have more regular transport and flights and shipping will all accrue because of increased revenue for the government. And it's possible. I mean, it is possible. But then again, some of these small islands may actually prefer not to have increased connectivity with the outside world. They have their own unique cultures and ways of doing things now. And if it was too easy for people to come, if it was less remote, it would have some big impacts on the way people are living in these islands.
That is something that I have never thought about, that the standard dichotomy of economic progress versus environmental harm, even the economic progress piece isn't necessarily what everybody is interested in.
No, I think you look at, we always go back to Nauru, the history of Nauru, with all their phosphate mining. Years ago, they were the richest people in the world per capita, and now they're amongst the poorest. But just did all that money in the economy do anything for them personally, for their health, for their longevity or anything? No, they all became very unhealthy. They got in, all their labour was imported from Tuvalu and Kiribati to do all the manual labour, and they were just the wealthy elite. And it was very, very unhealthy for them. And they won't like me saying that, but it's true. It was almost the destruction of their country in the end.
And that's a lesson that's apparent to Cook Islanders because they're essentially a neighboring community. So this is something that people in the Cook Islands are aware of. Was there also phosphate mining in the Cook Islands? Was this also a phenomenon in Cook Islands history?
No, not in the Cook Islands. In Kiribati and maybe French Polynesia, maybe they had some over there. But no, not in the Cook Islands.
So aside from fishing, the Cook Islands has never had a real resource extraction experience.
No, we don't. Our islands are too small to have much in the way of timber. So not like PNG or Solomon Islands, for example, that have a lot of extraction of timber.
Okay, well, Kelvin, I'm noticing that I've kept you over the time that I had said. So is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you think is important for the international deep sea mining conversation to be aware of? Anything that you would like to bring up before we wrap up?
Just maybe mention that there's 41 countries so far that have called for a moratorium on deep seabed mining, and the number's growing. And if any other countries are watching and want to push for a moratorium on deep seabed mining, we would encourage that. The more support for against deep seabed mining would be a good thing.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I had meant to ask you that I forgot to bring up was how you see Cook Islands as being in a position of, I don't know if leadership is the right word, but do other Pacific Island nations kind of look to what's going on in the Cook Islands and see how that's going to go before making up their own minds about how they respond to the deep sea mining question? And is there a lot of kind of collaboration with your organization and other similar organizations? Or again, I don't know how collective or separated the Cook Islands is from the other countries in similar positions.
We're part of a pretty good network of different organizations who are against deep seabed mining. Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. We're also members of IUCN and BirdLife, big international NGOs, which also don't support deep seabed mining. As far as other countries, I think some countries do look to the Cook Islands as having a good example of how to regulate deep seabed mining, because they put a lot of work into their legislation, and they do have a lot of environmental safeguards built in to the legislation, but there's loopholes in there which are harder to identify to the layman. But as I say, if we ever get to the stage of being in court, we'll be no doubt dealing with them. I mean, the whole Cook Islands is been declared the Malai Moana, a marine managed area. Some people say a marine park, but it's a multi-use marine park which allows deep seabed mining and fishing if that's agreed. But the overall goal of the Malama Marine Park is conservation, and we'll be reminding government of that in future if we think that there's some threat to the conservation of deep sea ecosystem.
Okay. Well, then, thanks very much for your time and taking the time to talk to me and to explain all of this to listeners. And is there anywhere that you send people who want to learn more about your organization and good information sources, people who are interested in learning more about deep sea mining? Where would you suggest people look?
Well, they could look at the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition website. They could look at our website, which is TIS cookislands.org, all one word. Our Facebook page, the Ipukarea Society Facebook page. We're running a series of reels at the moment because it's an election year, just asking Cook Islanders to think strongly about what they want for their future when they vote, and ask their candidates what their views are on issues, including deep seabed mining, and use that to choose who you vote for, rather than choosing the people who are, trimming your hedge in your front yard or chopping down a few trees for you, which is the way a lot of people end up voting here.
Okay, that's great. I'll put links to those things in the show notes and encourage people to follow up in those places. And thanks again for your time, Kelvin.
No, thank you, Eric. Nice talking to you.
Okay, well, I think that tying grass skirts and belly buttons into traditional wisdom and blending into the modern world is a great place to start wrapping up. I wonder if there's anything that we haven't touched on in this conversation that you would feel is important to mention before we sign off.
I just want to round off by reaffirming that I am very much against deep sea mining. I think it is just not commonsensical to despoil the environment that you live on, that you rely upon so much. I think it will cause food insecurity in our northern group islands and perhaps the neighbouring jurisdictions, and that there are many of these minerals, including rare earth elements, available on the land where you can mine with less destructive consequences. So just don't do it.
Okay. Well, Imogen, thank you very much for your time and for explaining this to me and to the listeners. Thanks for your decades of working to keep the Cook Islands environmentally safe.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye.